I'd like to kind of now introduce our wonderful speaker tonight, come all the way from Fitzrovia. And Mark, actually, among his many activities, he also plays synthesizers and drones and all manner of strange instruments and organs. And he will be providing sonic succor at the Kent conference in the shape of Raagnagrok, one of his Raagnagrok All-Stars, one of his many bands. But tonight he's here in his capacity as a speaker. He's also a writer, a publisher. He runs Strange Attractor Press. He also put on lots of events. He's been involved in many things: Megalithomania, Insect Festival, and oodles and oodles of other stuff. Anyway, so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Mark Pilkington. A warm welcome, please.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for coming, and it's great to be looking out at the audience at the October Galleries. I'm usually sitting looking in this direction, so that's a nice change of perspective. I'm going to be talking broadly about some sort of unusual ideas that are kind of expanded from my book Mirage Men that was published last year by Constable and Robertson and is hopefully still available downstairs for anyone who's lacking a copy. I'm told it's quite good. But I'll start with a reading, and I'll explain as we go on what the book and what this idea of deception and the abuses of enchantment is really about. So, they are not material creatures, they are spiritual beings. They live in outer space, and when they feel hungry, they swoop down and kill innocent women and children. They eat the corpses and then fly back to their spatial residences for a siesta in their bedrooms in space. It has been going on and on like this for years. This might sound like a sort of ancient piece of fairy lore or monster lore, but in fact it's from a news report from Pakistan's The Nation newspaper from last April, and is an interview with a Pakistani villager describing the impact that American CIA drone strikes are having on the rural environment. So to the people on the ground who aren't plugged in to the sort of global information media network, the pilotless strange craft that are coming in, flying over their heads and firing missiles at them and their families may as well be creatures from another planet or from another dimension. And that, I think, in a nutshell, describes perfectly what this presentation is about. Unfortunately, that appeared in the press just after I sent my book in to be published, so I couldn't include it. But and this is one of the Reaper drones that they're talking about. They're probably about, I think is this screen maybe a bit bigger in length and quite wide wingspans, quiet and heavy. So there's the book. My book, what's it about? It's really partly a conspiracy thriller, partly a cultural history tracing the idea that we are being visited by superior beings from outer space who travel to Earth in flying saucers and have shaped the course of human history. It's an idea that's incredibly powerful and has permeated the very fabric of our culture, reaching the highest echelons of power across many nations. And, for example, John Podesta, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff in the White House, is an avid believer in a lot of these ideas. Bill Richardson, I think his name was, who's the governor of New Mexico and was an early candidate for the Democratic presidency is also a believer. A lot of people in the American military and militaries in South America, in France, in this country, all over the world. This is an idea that has really reached the heart of the kind of ruling elites, well, not elites, the ruling bodies, the ruling establishments. But really, I'm less interested in ideas of UFOs and aliens than I am in the stories that people tell about them. And these stories are really just as important as the incidents themselves. And of course, the two can be very different. In the remembering and the retelling, a sighting of a Chinese lantern flying over Hampstead Heath may eventually become a Nazi flying saucer from the hollow earth. And these tales, as they grow more distant from their source, evolve and expand like ripples from a stone thrown into a pond, interfering and interacting with each other and with us, the people who hear them. And it's at this point that they become myths. And over time, these myths shape our imaginations and change the way that we experience the world and actually alter reality for those who ingest them. So really, they are powerful consciousness-shaping agents. And this is the true power of the UFO, or indeed any myth. And I'm actually going to be talking mostly not about UFOs tonight. Myth-making is a human necessity, and it's one of the things we do best. They're useful, they guide us and help us to make sense of the incomprehensible, those things and events too strange or complex for us to understand. They provide emotionally satisfying answers to difficult questions. How did we get here? Why is the world like it is? Why are we at war with people who were once our friends? Why did the World Trade Center collapse? Where do UFOs come from? In the book, I suggest that popular ideas about UFOs have been shaped and manipulated by disinformation specialists within Americans' intelligence apparatus and military to create a kind of punctuated equilibrium. The law is perfectly capable of sustaining itself. It has a vibrant life of its own, supported by a complex patchwork of believers, promoters, seekers, and charlatans, and nourished by the sightings of thousands of new witnesses each year. The law does, however, provide a useful cover for certain clandestine operations, and is thus employed by the Mirage Men if and when it is expedient to do so. For tonight's talk, however, I'm going to be digressing from the main theme of the book to consider a few examples of other folkloric themes and memes that have been exploited or, in rarer instances, created by members of the military and intelligence communities or by their actions. Just some examples of real and imaginary flying saucers and UFOs. That's really big. How small people are. Yes, that's actually a silent helicopter there. They've only recently been revealed to be real. They've always been kind of technological demons of the conspiracy arsenal that they've been flying since 1970 or so, it turns out. But Aerospace magazine ran the first article on them a couple of years ago. Okay, so deception, of course, is an evolutionary survival mechanism, and here we have some fine examples of sneaky deceivers. That's a cuttlefish looking like a leaf, a moth looking like a leaf, a stick insect, that's an ant, and an anglerfish who uses his luminous kind of proboscis to lure prey into its gaping maw, a bit like a deep-sea UFO. So yes, a survival mechanism practiced throughout the natural world to lure prey to hungry mouths, to disguise potential prey from hungry mouths, or simply to get other species to behave or to interact with you in specific ways. And we humans use deception for exactly the same reasons, although as our relationship to the world around us and to each other is somewhat more complex than that of our animal kin, So we've developed ever more devious tools, techniques, and schemes for deceiving each other, especially when it comes to those two areas in which we excel, politics and warfare. So from ye olden days, humans have understood the advantage that fear gives one over your enemies. In the 5th century BC, the Persian leader Xerxes warned his Greek enemies that Persia's arrows would blot out the sun, leading a Spartan to retort that they would welcome a fight in the shade. Writing in the 1st century AD, Tacitus described the fearsome German tribe, the Hari, who trick out their innate ferocity by the help of art and choice of time. They blacken their shields and dye their bodies. They choose pitchy dark nights for their battles and strike fear into their enemies by the terrifying and shadowy appearance of an army of the dead. No enemy, writes Tacitus, is able to withstand this unaccustomed and seemingly hellish apparition, and in every battle they are defeated at first sight. A parallel to these early astute uses of psychological warfare can be seen in an equally ancient tradition of interpreting portents and omens before a battle, perhaps most famously, as seen here, the appearance of Halley's Comet in 1066, regarded perhaps retrospectively as a signal of coming doom for English King Harold before the Battle of Hastings. And we'll leap forward again now to the 16th century, when we read how belief in ghosts, the wandering souls of the deceased, were exploited by writers on both sides of the warring religious divide. And anti-Catholic rhetoric, particularly of the 16th century, included a great deal of bluster about the hoaxing of hauntings and miracles. So, in the 16th century, the Archbishop of York, Samuel Harsnet, attacked popish impostures, including making images to speak, vaults to sound, trunks to carry tales, churchyards to swarm, houses to rush, rumble and clatter with chains, highways, old graves, pits and woods to be haunted, all with the aim of driving the fear of God into the Protestant masses. Elsewhere, scabbed shin friars were said to place accomplices in specially built holes under the vaults of rich families, who would wail and moan when they came to pray for the souls of the deceased. The voices would then instruct the mourners to give money to the local Catholic church or monastery. But my favourite tale, and the one that's most relevant to the material in Mirage Men, comes from the 16th century Dutch Catholic humanist Desiderius Erasmus, who describes a priest on Easter Eve placing candles onto the backs of crowds, encouraging them to scuttle around a churchyard like the spirits of souls in purgatory. So we see a kind of picture here of the sort of deployment of superstition and folklore as a tool to deceive and control one's enemies or perceived enemies. Leaping forward to the early 20th century in a story some of you may be familiar with. On the right here, perhaps the greatest writer of supernatural fiction, Arthur Machen, who lived not far away for many of his, much of his life, and his short story, The Bowman. And this is a direct descendant of older tales of battlefield visions that presents us with an intriguing brew of folklore, fabrication and covert ostension. You probably all know the core story. The journalist and supernatural fiction writer Arthur Machen published his story The Bowman in the London Evening News on 29th of September 1914. It's a patriotic tale about our boys at the Battle of the Mons being saved by spectral archers from the Battle of Agincourt, who rain arrows down upon the Germans, so giving the British a vital opening through which they can retreat. Machen's tale hit a nerve, with many people seeming not to recognise it as fiction, and 6 months later, in what might appear to have been a case of ostension, whereby folkloric or fictional events manifest in reality, reports of genuine battlefield visions began to come back from the trenches. These first appeared in occult and spiritualist publications like Light and the Occult Review, but before long were being reproduced as true accounts in the newspapers and later in a book, On the Side of the Angels by Howard Begbie. As folklorist David Clarke has shown, however, the truth is a little more sinister and cynical. The stories that appeared in Light and the Occult Review just a few months after Macken's own story was published were actually placed there by an anonymous military officer and appeared in late 1915, soon after the horrors of the Second Battle of Wipers, involving the first use of chlorine gas, began to reach the public. And when a sceptical Macken challenged these angelologists, he was rebuffed, and his tale entered that familiar and deeply Fortean grey area between fact and fiction. So a fictional tale based on folkloric accounts provokes more folklore that has its origins in military disinformation, while the believers in the folklore refuse to accept that the original account was fictional at all. Forwarding to, here's a sort of contemporary drawing of a battlefield vision. Here's looks like a Crusader knight appearing alongside a wounded World War I soldier. So, reaching World War II and the years soon afterwards, we have this incredible and fascinating paper produced by RAND, which was a sort of research and development corporation initially founded by the US Air Force to do advanced studies for them, and it did everything from working out how a nuclear war would work to studying and extracting data from flying saucer sightings. And it was a really an amazing hotbed of unusual research and high-end data and number crunching. For this paper, The Exploitation of Superstitions for Purposes of Psychological Warfare by Jean M. Hungerford was published on the 14th of April 1950. It states that superstitions flourish in an atmosphere of tension and insecurity, and wonders, what evidence is there that some types of superstitions lose their credibility after enjoying a brief vogue? What types of superstitious appeals will be best adapted to the various audiences to be propagandized? A study of local superstitions, as reflected in popular folklore, might indeed be profitable in providing answers to these questions. In the 1920s, the British on Afghanistan's northwest frontier planted loudspeakers on aeroplanes telling tribal peoples that God was angry with them for breaking the peace. Much later in World War II, Germans and British employed fake astrologers to spread dire predictions. And it's also rumoured that the Germans fired magic lantern images onto clouds. So it's said that Jesus and the Virgin Mary were popular in order to again strike the fear of God into their enemies, and also perhaps to perhaps even to encourage them. Who knows? But this is a long and oft-told kind of story, and I'm still trying to find an actual account of this, but I haven't been able to find one. In World War II, again, Captain Neville Maskelyne, famous illusionist and magician, who's best known for his inflatable tanks, which were designed to distract aerial reconnaissance planes, and also for making the port of Alexandria vanish and reappear several miles down the coast so that German bombers attacked a decoy, refers to other monstrous antics that he got up to during the war, and this is from a book called Magic Top Secret that was published in 1949. Our men were able to use illusions of an amusing nature in the Italian mountains, especially when operating in small groups as advanced patrols scouting out the way for our general moves forward. sorry, there's masculine and one of his inflatable tanks. In one area in particular, they used a device which was little more than a gigantic scarecrow, about 12 feet high, and able to stagger forward under its own power and emit frightful flashes and bangs. The thing scared several Italian Sicilian villages, appearing in the dawn, thumping its deafening way down their streets, with great electric blue sparks jumping from it, and the inhabitants, mostly illiterate peasants, simply took to their heels to the next village, swearing that the devil was marching ahead of the invading English. Like all tales spread among uneducated folk, this is still masculine, and helped, no doubt, by our agents, the story assumed almost unimaginable proportions. Villages on the route of our advance began to refuse sullenly to help the retreating Germans, and to take sabotage against them. And then, instead of waiting for our troops to arrive with food and congratulations of their help, the poor people congesting the roads along which German motorised transport was struggling to retire. The German tankmen would then sometimes cut through the refugees, inflaming feeling even more, and what began almost as a joke on our part was soon a sharp weapon which punished the Germans severely, if indirectly, for several critical weeks. So that's a very direct kind of deployment of what might seem to us as a somewhat sort of hokey and sort of lo-fi piece of machinery to spread incredible ideas and fear amongst people on the ground. I mentioned that the Germans and the British were spreading astrological disinformation during World War II, and this was used to some extent, and we know quite a lot about what the British were up to thanks to a great book called The Black Game by Eric Howe, who was a young printer during the Second World War and found himself much in demand working for Britain's political warfare executive under Dennis Sefton Delmer, a former foreign correspondent for the Daily Express. Delmer specialised in the black arts, conjuring up schemes to mislead and demoralise Britain's enemies, and considered himself more of an artist than a soldier. Working under Delmer, Alec Howe specialised in print, his work ranging from faking stamps and ration cards to more elaborate publications, such as a 104-page booklet widely circulated to German troops all over Europe, known as the Melinderer, and there's a copy. In it, a Dr. Volhat, which translates as Dr. Dogood, recommended numerous ways in which soldiers might feign illness and injury in order to avoid military service. These range from distilling herbs to produce dramatic symptoms, to faking doctors' prescriptions and acting out conditions from sprains to amnesia. And we know how successful this project was because before long the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians were all producing their own versions and distributing them in their own territories. So this was a useful and crafty tool. Another of the political warfare executives' print projects that Hal was responsible for was Der Zenit, and I haven't been able to find the photograph, unfortunately, which is a fake astrological journal that ran for 6 issues between 1942 and 1943. Written and distributed in Germany, and elegantly designed, it fed into the already superstitious Nazi mindset, whereby both Hitler and Himmler employed their own personal astrologers and questioned on astrological grounds everything from the choice of Hitler's physician to the timing of U-boat launches. And De Zenit used real astrologers to create subtly slewed data, and this is critical. The data was believable and convincing, at least for a short time, so that it would fool even the most ardent astrologer until perhaps it was too late. And this is really one of the sort of keys to the art of disinformation, is to make your information as convincing and believable as possible. It's something that's too absurd, if it's sort of fed into the bloodstream or the cultural stream too soon, will also throw the game. So you generally kind of gently amp up the weirdness, as I like to say, softly, softly, catch you monkey. But the results of these kinds of black propaganda operations aren't always obvious and can take months, even years, to have a noticeable effect. However, once successfully sown, a single seed of uncertainty can grow to become a forest of doubt. As Captain J.S.C. Fuller, a British tank expert, occultist, and a friend of both Aleister Crowley and Adolf Hitler, told readers of the Occult Review, magic was still a formidable weapon under the name of propaganda, adding, "Is not Dr. Goebbels a magician?" So we move forward, we're kind of moving chronologically forward, decade by decade. We're now in the 1950s, and remember the Rand document was published at the beginning of the 1950s and was sort of drew upon the lessons of World War II, and that could be used in the new Cold War. And it was at this time that the people who had earned their stripes in wartime intelligence and deception really began to flex their muscles. At this time, the still wet behind the ears CIA hired a famous stage illusionist, John Mulholland, seen here, to write a manual for what he called tricksters, appropriately enough, agents in the field using sleight of hand and other magical techniques to fool their opponents. And here's a great sort of facsimile reproduction of the book, which was republished last year. It was actually thought to have been lost and was rediscovered a few years ago, and being sort of edited by a former head of the CIA's sort of technical tricks department, who's, as you'd expect, also a member of the American Magic Circle. Yeah, John Mulholland, as well as sort of working out great sleight of hand tricks and devices for agents in the field, also interestingly investigated seances and telepathy experiments for the CIA, especially those of Joseph Ryan at Duke University, and looking for anything really that they could use and deploy in other areas, and sort of learning what the kind of techniques and sort of atmospheres that were required to sort of convince people that any sort of setups in that area were convincing. But like most illusionists, Mulholland remained unconvinced by the seance room phenomena that he saw, though as we know, his researches into telepathy would, 2 decades later, feed into the US military and the CIA's remote viewing psychic spying program. But perhaps the most sinister and still little known organisation of the Cold War was the Psychological Strategy Board, many of whose papers are still secret. The board, founded in the late 1940s, was tasked with coordinating psychological operations both at home and abroad, and ensuring that Americans and America looked, sounded and thought right. And if this sounds Orwellian, then that's because it was. Even the first strategy paper is still classified, though traces of it can still be found referenced in other documents. And according to one of these, the PSB's role was to develop, quote, a machinery to promote the American way of life and to counter doctrines hostile to American objectives. To do so, they would take in all fields of intellectual interest, from anthropology and artistic creation to sociology and scientific methodology, and would require the control, procurement and production of everything from scholarly seminars, like this one, symposia, special tomes, learned journals and libraries, to church services, comic books, folk songs, folklore, folk tales, itinerant storytellers and musicians. And the PSB broadcast its message over the TV, over the radio, at the cinema, from ships and aircraft, and even considered the use of 3-dimensional moving images for added realism. And much like now, America was enjoying a bit of a 3D boom at the time in the early 50s. And amongst the more famous kind of projects that the Psychological Strategy Board and its spin-off, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, were involved with was promoting Jackson Pollock, who was heavily pushed as a kind of example of great American avant-garde culture. And the great fear that America had was that Europe, so Mother Europe, thought America was only interested in sort of Superman and comic books and trash culture, and they wanted to show that no, we can do serious, mature, difficult culture as well. They also bankrolled a sort of fairly respected sort of highbrow cultural magazine called Encounter for a few decades, which of course no one else except for the people who were receiving the funds knew that they were actually working for the CIA. But again, this was to promote American culture abroad. They would do things like organise tours of orchestras to play difficult music around Europe and all sorts of things. Really interesting. There's a great book, Who Pays the Piper, by Francis Stoner Saunders, which is the only book that's sort of ever gone into much detail on that. But one of the truly great Cold Warriors was this man, Air Force Colonel Edward Lansdale, an early master of the art of psychological warfare. Lansdale, according to some sources, the inspiration for Alden Pyle and Graham Greene's The Quiet American, was a former advertising man turned intelligence specialist. His years in the advertising game served Lansdale extremely well in the intelligence world. Here he coupled his understanding of the power of perception and presentation with a firm conviction that America's well-being required dominance of the Third World, a goal that was to be achieved by winning over the hearts and minds, and he coined that phrase, of the population and creating a state of economic dependency on the US. And didn't they do well, ladies and gentlemen? Having fought in the Philippines during the Second World War, in the early 1950s, Lansdale was recruited by the agency, the CIA, to assist the Philippine Defense Minister in his battle against the local communist guerrilla insurgents, the Huks. And from the campaigns that he organised, it's very likely, I think, that he had been reading the Rand paper that we saw earlier. Lansdale set up the Filipino Civil Affairs Office as a base for psychological warfare operations, formerly coded as PSYOPs, and now last year changed to MISO, which means, I think, Military Intelligence Special Operations. So, but PSYOPs, I think they thought sounded a bit sinister. And like market researchers at an ad agency, Lansdale's team tried to get inside the minds of the local communities to find out how they lived, what they most hoped for, and of course, what they most feared. So one PSYOPs project involved flying a small plane, as described in the RAND document, over Huk territories hidden by thick cloud cover. The aircraft used megaphones to broadcast the voice of God, which warned villagers who sheltered or fed the Huk insurgents that they would be forever cursed, and their children too. Another operation involved exploiting rural superstitions surrounding the aswang, a vampire from Philippine mythology. And yes, this is a genuine photograph of an aswang taken recently in the Philippines and distributed over the internet. Lansdale's team seeded rumours that an aswang lived in a region occupied by the Huk, and word of the blood-sucking menace soon spread among the guerrillas and their supporters until one day their worst fears were confirmed. A guerrilla was found dead with punch marks on his throat and the blood drained from his body. Rather than being a victim of the aswang, however, the unlucky Huk had been ambushed by Lansdale's team, killed, hung from a tree until he was drained of blood, then laid out to be discovered by his colleagues. To the other Huk, this confirmed the aswang stories, and they fled the area in terror. And by 1953, the attempted communist insurgency had been successfully quashed, and Lansdale would become one of the first operatives to enter Vietnam, paving the way to the American incursion there. And after that, he played a key role in a less successful project, Operation Mongoose, which famously made 8 unsuccessful attempts on Fidel Castro's life, involving things like exploding cigars and and wetsuits and needles with poison with curare and things like that. But yes, Lansdale went to Vietnam, and there were plenty of psyops going on in Vietnam as well, where the American Army's 6th Psyops Battalion began broadcasting an audio recording called The Wailing Soul, and that's one of the original master tapes for it.
Wandering soul.
The Wandering Soul. I'm trying to record this. Yes, and this is actually a photograph of 2 Vietnamese actors recording it. So, the Wandering Soul will be a recording played through loudspeakers mounted on backpacks and in helicopters, and soldiers would walk through the jungle broadcasting a very spooky conversation that preyed on Vietnamese traditions of the unquiet dead. And a little girl, seen on the right, was talking to her dead father, the ghost of her dead father, who had been killed in battle. And in Vietnamese tradition, if you were killed away from home and not buried, then in your home village, then your soul would wander for eternity. So this wandering soul is lost and afraid out there in the darkness. And the recording, which made heavy use of eerie reverb effects and traditional Vietnamese funeral music, was incredibly effective, spooking American soldiers as well as Vietnamese. So, Lansdale's Aswang and the Wandering Soul were just 2 of countless and really countless psychological deception operations carried out during the hot years of the Cold War. And in my book, I argue that the fast-evolving UFO law was simply another one of these operations, but one that kind of got out of hand and ended up biting the bottoms of those who had created it. Just quickly, we're sort of running a bit out of time. Other examples, I think, of what were almost certainly PSYOPs operations. There's a good quote, actually, from a man called Tom Braden, who was the former head of the International Organizations Division of the Directorate of Plans, which was the CIA's PSYOPs division, who wrote in 1973 there were so many CIA projects at the height of the Cold War that it was impossible for one man to keep them all in balance. So here we have a man called Tom Slick, who was an explorer, heir to an oil fortune, and a Yeti hunter, and it was him who in 1957 led an expedition to find the Himalayan Yeti in the sort of borders between Tibet and China. And now, of course, a man like Slick, who could enter dangerous and unexplored territories and gather information, was exactly the sort of person that the CIA and other organizations was interested in. And by the time Slick had entered Tibet, the Chinese had invaded in 1950, so his information would have been extremely useful in kind of making sense of what was going on behind the closed borders. And there's really no question that the CIA were heavily involved in Tibet at this time, and interestingly, starting in 1957, began supporting and funding what would be a disastrous uprising there, and they also played a key role in extracting the Dalai Lama following the first failed coup in 1959. So I would think, and I'm not the only one to suggest, that Slick's 1957 expedition was a convenient cover for a spying operation, or perhaps more likely, a genuine expedition in which some CIA operatives were hitching a ride, or perhaps Slick and his men were asked to keep an eye out for anything that might aid their cause. It's also worth noting that Slick's private airways, his private airline, Slick Airways, later became a carrier for AirAsia, which was part of the CIA's own infamous Air America fleet. We might also wonder how many lake monster sightings are connected to testings of submarines, and we know one case where lake where this is the case, Lake Penderay in Idaho, the fifth deepest lake in the USA, that has always had lake monster lore associated with it. And I'm not suggesting the lore obviously predates military use of the area and is connected to other sort of physical and supposed conditions of the lake. But there's no doubt that the US Navy did encourage people to talk about monster sightings, and although they denied ever testing submarines in the lake until 2001 actually, and where they came clean. So, other areas and avenues of worthy of sort of further exploration. The National Enquirer. Those of you who've seen the Men in Black films, there's a sort of running joke that the Men in Black get all their real news from the National Enquirer, and actually that's not, I suspect, not too far from the truth. Its founder, Gene Pope Jr., General Pope Jr., was an MIT graduate who joined the CIA in 1951, spending a year being trained in psychological operations before the next year buying the New York Enquirer from Randolph Hearst for $75,000, borrowing a great deal of that from his godfather, who was a top mobster, Frank Costello. It also required $250,000 a year to keep afloat, which is quite a lot of money for a 25-year-old. But I suspect some of it may come from the CIA or one of their cutouts, and certainly a lot came from the mob, there's no question of that. But one of the examples of an early National Enquirer story during the 1950s was that the Italian mafia was a myth concocted by the devilish communists, so that was the mafia money talking in that article. But by the mid-70s, after the Air Force shut down its UFO investigation, the National Enquirer kind of took on the mantle, and here we have a great combination of Elvis, drugs, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, from I presume 77 or so. But by the time that the CIA was under heavy scrutiny and investigation by a Senate commission headed by Frank Church, and that really changed the way that the CIA operated, the National Enquirer was a keen advocate for sort of undermining Church's inquiry and promoting the CIA as it was, and sort of retaining its procedures and sort of methods of working. But of course, as happened, as they didn't succeed, and the CIA was really turned inside out in the mid-70s. It's also interesting that Richard Nixon's Defense Secretary Melvin Laird was a close friend of General Pope's and gave a moving eulogy at his funeral. Okay, so other great examples of sort of disinformation and folklore having a real impact on society. The AIDS as a bioweapon story, which you will still see discussed, on almost any AIDS denialist website or on conspiracy websites, and a lot of it promoted by this man, Alan Cantwell, MD, in his book about the secret genocide plot. There's quite a lot. There's a lot on this in the book, but the first ever story about AIDS originating as an American bioweapon appeared on the 16th of July 1983 in Patriot, India's pro-Soviet daily newspaper, titled "AIDS May Invade India, Mystery Disease Caused by US Experiments." The letter was written by an anonymous, well-known scientist and anthropologist, and suggested that the AIDS virus had been developed by Pentagon biological warfare specialists at Fort Detrick, Maryland, as an ethnic weapon targeting blacks and Asians. The story just gathered momentum and pace. By 1986, it was being discussed openly in the Journal for the Royal Society of Medicine, and on the 26th of October 1986, made the front page of Britain's Sunday Express. And from here it really grew out of control. Photographs of an ethnic weapon being fired in the field appeared in curating newspapers and were picked up and distributed by Reuters. And in March 1987, the story made America's CBS Evening News, so this was prime time. So what had begun as a little sort of microbial drop in an Indian, small Indian Soviet newspaper was now being broadcast into millions of American homes and minds. By now, the ethnic weapon had a code name, Plus Morbidic Plus, and the Americans put pressure on the Soviets to admit that they'd made it up, but the Soviets denied it until March 1992, after the fall of the Soviet regime, when the intelligence chief of Russia, who later became the Prime Minister, Yevgeny Primakov, admitted that the original story was a Directorate A special, and Directorate A was the KGB's disinformation wing. And Directorate A was spending about $3 billion a year during the height of the Cold War on disinformation, which actually is dwarfed by America's spending. The CIA, which is just one of many agencies deploying these kinds of tactics, also dedicated $3.5 billion a year to disinformation. And if you read, there's some good books that give you a sense of just how much control these organisations had, especially in smaller countries. A great book, just kind of forgotten the author's name, but called CIA Diary. The author's name will come back to me, and he was stationed in Uruguay and later in Ecuador, and just talked about routinely every day. They would just run newspaper stories, sort of pushing whatever stories they wanted to have promoted. So, as I said earlier, if you read Mirage Men, you'll see that I think the sort of flying saucer story is really just another example of this kind of disinformation in the field, and one that worked extremely well. These are examples of sort of UFO-related disinformation that are being leaked out into the sort of newosphere. And this is one of the organisations I suggest has been responsible for the Special Programs Department for the Air Force. Certainly in the early 80s, they were at work. It's a nice mystery craft flying around the globe here. So, these are really just a few examples, and I'm sure just the tip of a huge and rather peculiarly shaped iceberg. And I certainly don't want to leave you with the impression that all or even most folklore has its origins in dirty government operations. Far from it. I think these are in the minority, and folklorists know that folklore, like life, will emerge given the slightest opportunity to do so in even the most difficult conditions. As I suggested earlier, it's clear that the intelligence services are simply opportunists and will run with whatever they think will work and is appropriate and expedient to a given situation. And their activities may, as in the case of the UFO or the AIDS law, sometimes generate new myths of their own, but more often than not, that they're simply exploiting pre-existing folklore, occasionally adding some new detail or colour that may eventually find its way into the mainstream. And just to give you a couple of recent examples of sort of what I suspect are more UFO-related sort of law entering the sort of political sphere. There's been a rush of UFO sightings and law spreading in Iran at the moment over the last few years. Some of you may have seen this from a few weeks ago. I don't believe this was active disinformation. I think this was just a hoax, but it was a UFO video shot over the dome in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and which is only the most contested sacred site on the planet. But I suspect this was I know it was fabricated, but as I said, it was fabricated for a laugh rather than for any sort of political reasons. But you can also imagine the sort of repercussions that these kinds of incidents can have in the political sphere, and you already can see that just by hanging around any of the sort of conspiracy websites. And this is this is a patch from one of the American Air Force's sort of classified programs, but you've got a big question mark. The moons suggest they work at night. Don't ask, and none of your fucking business. So thanks very much, and we've got some time for questions. Yes, so great. Boom.
Okay, well, I'm going to use my usual phrase and take the host prerogative and kind of ask the first question. And then we'll open up, we've got a little bit of time for some questions from the floor.
Oh, sorry, just dropping it. Yes, CIA diary, Philip Aggie is his name on you.
Very good. I mean, that was brilliant. Well, absolutely fascinating. It's kind of strange to think that perhaps this light that was kind of hoaxed over the dome of the rock could have been a couple of teenagers sitting at home, it's gone viral on the internet, and then causing Armageddon. Which would be sort of quite ironic, really.
Don't joke about it.
No, well, it's kind of highly conceivable, really. But maybe you just tell us a little bit more about some of the stories. I'm particularly interested in the disappearance of Port Alexandria.
Okay, yeah, that's Neville Maskelyne was a hugely famous and successful illusionist, stage illusionist in the sort of 30s and 40s, and was, I don't know who would be the equivalent of Darren Brown or David Copperfield, probably not Paul Daniels, but he was really, he was known for doing just incredible feats. And what he actually did, there was a concern that the Germans were going to destroy Alexandria, which was a critical supply and sort of supply port and a strategic base for the Allies in the Middle East. So what he did, quite brilliantly and simply and cunningly, was got everyone in Alexandria to switch their lights off, and then further up the coast, a few miles up the coast, they basically created a light pattern that was exactly the same in shape as Alexandria, seen from the air, using lanterns and torches, and built a few kind of structures and just lit it up at night. So the Alexandria vanished and reappeared further up the coast.
And they bombed it.
Yeah. So it's very simple. And that's what's really important about all this. There's nothing complicated about any of this. It's all very, very simple, just quite lo-fi and ingenious. These days, things are, obviously you've got digital video technology that allows things like the Temple Mount video to be created, and but again, you don't need very much. There's another news story this week. An artist in Ohio has admitted that he was launching a few tied together lanterns that created a UFO story that made the national news in America this month. So yeah, it's all very
Try this at home.
Do try this at home. Exactly. All of the most of the projects run by the intelligence services tend to be no more complex. I mean, the most complex would involve sort of mechanical dummies or sleight of tools and sleight of hand techniques and things like that. And these days, a lot of digital work, I would imagine. But I don't know if there's anyone here from the intelligence services. Maybe you can enlighten us.
But we've only got talking of lo-fi. We've only got one microphone, so if I can run up and down, John Ely with the microphone, and we'll take some questions from the floor. If anybody has any questions at all? Yes.
I mean, you're not from the intelligence services, so you may not be able to answer this, but I'm curious because the press TV is an Iranian bias. And I just wonder what on earth the Iranians have to gain by actually saying that, we're part of the UFO myth-making, which seems to be what they're trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say whether... Sorry, it's hard to surmise whether these are stories that have been seeded perhaps by... example, a previous example that that might make some sense of it. It was actually in the 80s when America was, was angry with Gaddafi and was basically trying to destabilise the Gaddafi regime in Libya. This is in the mid-80s. And one of their key projects that they were going to do until the story was leaked to the press and they had to cancel it was fly basically UFOs, ghost planes over Libya and create a panic and fear on the ground. And they were going to use this. They have a great technology which I talk a lot about in the book, which has been called Palladium in the past, which allows them to manipulate radar paints and basically fly aircraft of any shape and size that they like on radar screens, and they could also fire illuminated drones and missiles and things. So basically their thinking was that by creating this kind of anxiety on the ground, this would help to destabilise the regime. And it was called Project Vector, I think, but it was the cat was let out of the bag in the Washington Post, and they never did it. But you wonder if similar projects are going on in other areas around or in the Middle East. About when was it? When I first started working on the book, so about 2004, there was a flap of UFO sightings in Iran that was all centred conveniently enough over their new nuclear facilities. And you can ask several questions. Is this a nation that's hostile to or suspicious of Iran, basically just showing that they're there watching what's going on and that nobody can hide from them? And then what did happen was there was a UFO flap over the city, over the country, and some amazing stories started emerging of like strange robotic aliens with sort of claw-like arms being seen flying around and landing in different parts of the country. The Iranian Air Force said they were going to have a thorough investigation into the UFO sightings, and we never heard, I didn't hear any more about it. But we don't know exactly what's behind it, but it certainly creates problems. Perhaps, you could get really tangled and say perhaps the Iranian government would prefer to spread UFO stories than to admit that the Americans or the Israelis or whoever are flying over their nuclear enrichment plants. So I don't know, you can play it and look at it from any direction you like, but we don't know exactly what the reasons are. And in fact, even when it comes to there are multiple. I also don't think when it comes to the American sort of UFO story that there was any one particular purpose behind it. I think there were multiple sort of purposes to different operations, but that all gradually kind of congealed into the same myth. And again, that's something I talk a bit about in the book. So I don't think there's any one great grand unified conspiracy to kind of promote beliefs about extraterrestrials or such things. Although I also hint at some reasons why there might have been sometimes. Anyway.
Should we have a bit more questions for the
more questions. Is that helpful? I mean, you just have to look at things from every angle, like it's a Rubik's Cube.
The American UFO flaps were originally Disinformation sort of a project. What cultural phenomenon did it exploit to get traction in the first place?
It exploited the UFO story. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, for one thing, the UFO story is ancient. It's always bubbling under the surface of the culture. I don't think, for example, Kenneth Arnold's. He's the guy who first described seeing lights skimming like saucers over Mount Rainier in Washington State. I think he genuinely saw what he saw, and whatever it was, whether it was pelicans or atomic craft. But what's interesting is that he became something of a sort of national media celebrity, and what he was doing was talking about American secret aircraft, probably atomic-powered aircraft, or possibly Soviet aircraft. He certainly wasn't talking about extraterrestrial visitors. And at a time when Paranoia and 47, the Americans had just discovered that there were Soviet moles in the White House and all areas of the military and the Air Force, the paranoia had never really been as potent before, so they just had to investigate any avenue that cropped up. And I think when Arnold started talking about American secret aircraft and nuclear technologies, what he didn't know was that actually the US Air Force were trying to develop a nuclear-powered engine at the same time, and this would have, of course, caused all sorts of problems and concerns. So I think what they then did was check him out and set up, as I talk about in the book, a very weird kind of honey trap for him that would sort of feed into the law. But you know, it was something that perhaps they leapt in and were sort of manipulating these early stories, but I don't think they were generating all of them from an early stage. A later example that's which is openly talked about now is in the 50s, in the early 50s, when early flights of the U-2 were taking place. The Air Force's sort of UFO investigation team, Project Blue Book, would go and interview UFO witnesses and actually be mapping their sightings against their own sort of logs of flight plans and times of the U-2, and they were sort of keen to know how visible the U-2 was to people on the ground. And in the early days, it was very visible because it was futuristic silver, so as it caught the sun, it would sort of flare up and glow. And they learned actually from this research to paint it black. But while also promoting sort of simultaneously, so it's a weird double game, and they're simultaneously promoting UFO sightings by sending UFO investigators from the Air Force to investigate. And of course, they were also genuinely concerned about infiltration from above by enemy planes. But they would promote vigilance and caution about UFO sightings while also denying to the people they spoke to that they had actually seen anything untoward at all. And they would tell them they'd seen weather balloon or Venus, while perhaps in some cases knowing that in fact they had seen the U-2 but couldn't know about it. Anyway, that's the roundabout way.
Do you think that itself, the investigators contributed to the Men in Black phenomenon?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, the Men in Black thing is a whole separate cattle of Men in Black, can of Men in Black, sorry. But
people talked a lot about people turning up, not necessarily from the Air Force, but turning up witnesses' phones.
it was actually,
them in a very strange way.
yeah, and that was actually often, it's a very complex and actually brilliant story where you have a combination of intelligence agents dressing up as people from military organisations to quiz people. You have military guys from one force dressing up as members of another to interrogate people. You have UFO researchers dressing up in funny costumes to interview people. There's a very kind of complex mulch going on. And one of the things, the sort of first people to talk about Men in Black, Gray Barker and John Keel and sorry, I just forgot his name. Anyway, John Keel and Gray Barker, the key ones, they were arch pranksters and would actually joyously hoax other UFO researchers by turning up on their doorsteps and behaving strangely and sort of interrogating them. So that's another example. I suspect that actually the UFO people, the investigators themselves, began the UFO, the Men in Black law, and that the Air Force then made use of that later. And there's a great internal document from the mid-60s, actually, from California, where you have a sort of Air Force, I can't remember which base it is in California, maybe Edwards. You have a sort of base security guy sending out a memo saying, we're getting reports of people dressed as in Air Force uniforms going around and quizzing people about their UFO sightings. You know, if this is you, can you please stop it? It's causing us all sorts of problems. So, yes.
I think we've got time for one more question. Anybody from the floor? Yeah.
Why did the Mafia fund the National Enquirer?
Sorry?
Why did the Mafia fund the National Enquirer?
Because Generoso Pope Jr. was from a mafia family, and his Generoso Pope Jr., who found it was from a mafia family, and it was partly an investment, I would think, partly as we saw in the 50s, they could then run pro-mafia stories, telling people that tales of the mafia were actually just an insidious communist plot to undermine America. The mafia had been very deep, during World War II, the American military benefited a lot from mafia involvement, and they'd always been friendly. So the mafia ran all the harbours and ports up and down America's east coast. The mafia helped the Americans a great deal in Italy and in Sicily and sort of in the outlying regions. The mafia, of course, generally capitalist and sort of pro-commerce and quite sort of American friendly. So I don't know exactly why they would, fund the National Enquirer, but it seems that he was certainly getting them a great deal of money from somewhere, and that was $250,000 was a lot of money in those days, and that was what they reckoned was losing in a year, each year, sorry. But it was, it took several years for it to reach a sort of buoyant state. So I would wonder if some of it was mafia money and some of it was maybe CIA. But certainly Frank Costello, who was a very powerful senior mobster, gave him, I think, 20 grand at the beginning to get involved. There's quite a lot written about it, so I'm sure you could sort of get more detail. Exactly, money laundering. Yeah, I mean, there's multiple possible uses. Money laundering, and they might have just thought it was a good investment. They weren't only involved in crime. Waste management.
Mark, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Can we give Mark another round of applause?